From logically from Auguste Sandaire, I wanted to show the photographs of, I think, some of the most powerful photographs of the 20th century, which are those taken by the American Jewish photographer Roman Vishniac, who was hired by the European headquarters of the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee during the late 1930s to document Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. Faced with rising unemployment, widespread poverty, and the rise of anti-Semitism, and the tightening of immigration restrictions, the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee needed to try and document the plight of the people living in Jewish communities in Eastern Europe who are obviously under threat. And these are an extraordinarily powerful and immensely precious picture of a completely vanished world, and I think that this is photojournalism at its absolute finest and most precious. Backtracking about 4 decades, and go into another area of portraiture, looking at glamour and portraits, which was and the rise of autochrome. Autochrome revolution, the autochrome process developed by the Lumiere brothers, who were already seen with Albert Kahn's ethnographic photographs, revolutionized photography. Just the colors were so intense and vivid that photographs still today have extraordinary beauty and power. That's a remarkable portrait of Rodin. That's a portrait of an Indian artist by her father, which could have been taken yesterday, and that was taken in 1908. And used for sort of fantasy scenarios. And also, this is one of my favourite photographs, and it's completely inexplicable. It's by a Belgian photographer named Paul Sano, and it's a joint split photograph. It's a photograph of his mother, but he's as like a collage. He's also posted a photograph, pasted on a photograph of a solar eclipse, which is just the most incredible juxtaposition and sort of surrealism before the fact, 10, 15 years before the surrealist movement actually got going. Autochrome is just perfect for capturing portraits. This is another great English, unheralded English woman photographer, SL3 De Lange, who lived in Cambridge, who took a series of hundreds of photographs of her daughter, which are totally remarkable. And I think that they are the equal of any fashion photograph taken today. These were taken in about 1910. And just the naturalism and the power of it. One of the great autochrome photographers was the German photographer Heinrich Kuhn, who used abstraction as well to create portraits of his wife and friends. They obviously have a lot in common with Impressionism. And 3 photographs by the person by Lieutenant Mervyn O Gorman, who this was a cache of photographs that were discovered about 5 years ago. He was a distinguished soldier, but he was also, and this is a job that I certainly envy, he was a pioneering motorist. He pioneered motorsports in this country, but he was also the head of the Royal Balloon Factory, which unfortunately is a job that's no longer available. But these are all photographs he took of. He was also a pioneering amateur photographer, and these are extraordinary. These are photographs of his daughter. He took hundreds of them over the course of several years, and they could have been taken today. And then some of the other really famous photographers like Deakin and Stieglitz also employed autochrome incredible effect. That's Deakin's photograph of, I can't remember the name of the model, but she's wearing designs by Sonia Delaunay. And that's extraordinarily powerful. That's kind of expressionist cinema 5 years before the filming of Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Steichen, again, a portrait of Lillian Gish. And then not autochrome, but the way that using atmosphere and photogravure procedure to photograph people in a certain mysterious way, and to hint at psychological states through the use of sets and shadow and light. Edward West. This is the next couple are by Edward Weston, who was one of the first people. He used the same sort of tricks and techniques, but he pioneered something that we tend to associate with photographers of the last 20, 30 years, where he would document his relationships with various women, and would document from the beginning to the breakup. And be remarkably candid about it. Such as that photograph, which is from the end of a relationship. And it's actually called something like The End, the title of that photograph. That was taken about 1920, and that could be like a Nan Golding photograph. I'm going back again to Postimpressionism and the portrait painters of the late 19th, early 20th century, because the way that they depicted, the way that they used portraiture had an incredible influence on, well, in fact, the influence was two-way. Photographers influenced the art, the painters, and painters also influenced the photographers. So it was a symbiotic relationship. So obviously Degas was a very, very keen photographer, and his revolutionary framing of a lot of his portraits were drawn from his experiments with photography. And that monotype is extraordinary. And that's one of his photographs of a ballet dancer, some of which were quite extraordinary. That's a photograph of the young Vincent van Gogh. Obviously, Van Gogh was his possibly after Rembrandt is the most famous self-portrait artist, created the most famous self-portraits in history. With intensity, immediacy, and the absolute drive to reveal something inside, a psychological state to the wider world, in the most vivid way possible. These are some of the famous ones, but I wanted to show this, which is quite extraordinary. These can never be shown together. Obviously, the image on the left is incredibly famous, but the one on the right is not so well known because I think that's hidden deep in somebody's private collection. These were painted around the same time by Van Gogh, and they represent Van Gogh and Gauguin, and that is their title. They're meant to be displayed together, and that's intended as a portrait of Van Gogh, and that's intended as a portrait of Gauguin. And just the colours and everything, you can see that it's a homage to Gauguin's use, the colours that Gauguin commonly used, and his style, and they're meant to be portrayed. They're meant to be displayed side by side, and it was from the moment, the sort of very intense period where they lived together and they were great friends. Which ended rather badly, but I think this is using objects as portraiture. And this, I also wanted to use at the same time because I came across this the other day, and I think this is incredible. This is a self-portrait by Gauguin as a severed head. Obviously, when he was at his most depressed, he'd witnessed a public execution with a guillotine, and then went off and got completely plastered, and made this as a jug with, you can see all the sort of blood and entrails. So it's a naturalistic depiction of that. Munch, which I'm putting in here because he's a particular favourite, and I do think the expressions of psychological states you'll see repeated with lots of the photographers who I think were actually his influence is being he's been very underrated. I think that people have been influenced by him, as have increasingly the extraordinary self-portraits by the Belgian artist Leon Spillier, who's a particular favourite of mine, and I'm pleased to see he's becoming increasingly well known. He was fairly obscure up to about 10 years ago, but these whole series of about 50 self-portraits taken over the course of his life, painted during the course of his life, are quite a remarkable artistic autobiography, incredibly powerful. Sheila obviously is better known. He was introduced a new kind of honesty and candour and frankness into self-portraiture, painting, drawing and painting hundreds of self-portraits, doing all kinds of, at the most extreme. There are a lot, so you'll perhaps be relieved to hear, I haven't included here a lot of the images of him masturbating and things like that, which I'd say I'll spare you, but people had not portrayed themselves in such a naked and raw manner as this, and that's a portrait, a photograph of a very young Sheila looking incredibly intense. And Klimt too, and I haven't put any Klimt paintings in here because I love his drawing. I think his drawings are as powerful and as extraordinary as the more famous paintings, and that's called lasciviousness, and I think that says so much with so little. Edward Hopper too, a bit like Degas, the influence between cinema, photography and painting is seen to the full effect in the work of Hopper, who was actually active for 70 years. His first, he lived to a ripe old age. His first work was created in the first years of the 20th century, and he was still painting in the 70s. But these kind of dissociated, alienated people in urban landscapes, I mean, that has been, this is a tribute to the cinema itself. It's obviously set in the cinema, one of his most famous paintings, but people have actually created lots of cinematic tributes to this in some quite well-known films. And Picasso, obviously, again, another relentlessly honest portrayer of his own interior autobiography. Unfortunately, the first image I had on this was too small, so it didn't come up, which is of him, a portrait he painted when he was 15, where he's very, very cocksure. And then he was a very young man here when he arrived in Paris. And this is when he's still full of confidence, but he's had some hard knocks and isn't quite established. Then he's discovering a style, and he's sort of coming under the influence of African art that he was obsessed with in the very early 20th century, and you can see the mask-like face he's painting then. This is a self-portrait. And one of his attempts at creating a photographic self-portrait, and I think that is quite modest, and I think that's quite revealing that he should just photograph himself in a mirror. It may be a conscious allusion to Velázquez or Van Eyck. He was certainly obsessed with Velázquez and painted hundreds of dozens of different versions of it. And this is him confronting death as a very old man. This was painted in the last 2 years of his life, drawn in the last 2 years of his life. I put this in here because this is one of the most this work by Escher is a lithograph entitled Hand with Reflecting Sphere, and it harks back to the Parmigianino's image in a mirror, and I just think this influenced a lot of photographers, and the distortions that they use, as you'll see, because the next batch of things are self-portraits principally by photographers, but not exclusively. This is a portrait, so to show the influence of the artistic movements of the early 20th century, whether it be expressionism, postimpressionism, constructivism, etc., and how they influenced the way people took portraits. This is the Grand Duchess Anastasia, the daughter of the Russian Tsar. This is a self-portrait she took using, and it has a ghost-like quality, which is, I suppose, quite appropriate, but it's extraordinarily haunting. This is a full portrait of the photographer Dennis Stock by André Kertész, Cecil Beaton. That's Robert Duano, L. Lizitsky. So you can see that people, instead of just having naturalistic, people would use props, they would use all kinds of techniques, they would use special effects. That's Erwin Blumenfeld. That's a portrait of Cartier-Bresson by George Hoyningen-Huene. That's Herbert Matter, self-portrait. Ilse Bing. I love this. Obviously, he's not a photographer. This is a self-portrait by the poet Philip Larkin, which I think, and I love the incidental detail of the sort of banal things on his. It's obviously like his dressing table with the kind of talcum powder and bits and pieces of the kind of thing a provincial librarian of his age and class in 1950s Britain would have used. But I think that's a remarkably honest photograph and actually captures his personality well. That's Louis Fauré, prefiguring things like Vivian Maier and Saul Leiter. Photographers would also have themselves portrayed quite heroically. This is obviously the famous photograph of Margaret Bourke-White atop the Chrysler building. One of the most famous photographs of a photographer ever taken. That's Paul Strand's photograph of Alfred Stieglitz at work, grappling with some very unwieldy equipment. That's a young Richard Avedon. That's Werner Ruhr. That's a self-portrait by Lee Miller. And he is Polish photographer. This was actually taken in very early 20th century, and who's renowned for the very openness. And there he is again distorted in a funhouse mirror in a freak show, which was still in Coney Island in the 40s. And that's that's by Georgi Pinkashov, Azerbaijani photographer, and you can just see it is a self-portrait just in the glass there below the doves. Slightly more up to date, that's Iraqi mucking about. And that, finally in this section, this is by the Dadaist Philippe Soupeau, that's called Portrait of an Imbecile, and was created in 1922. So, one of the most interesting and influential artists of, it was obscure up until very, very recent, until the last 20 years, in terms of using photography and montage and things, was Claude Cahoon, who was who's the alter ego of Lucy Schwab, who was a surrealist writer and photographer, French, born in France. Whose work challenges all the fixed ideas about gender, identity, sexuality, and women's role in society, where such things were completely fixed. She was a transgender Jewish lesbian, and she also had an affair, a long-term affair, with her stepsister. And she was also a very, very brave anti-fascist. So she's basically like the Daily Mail's worst nightmare, but in the 1920s, everything's got a litany of things there. But she, one thing that's very significant is that one of the people that holds the held, I think some of them have been sold, held the largest collection of her work. When you could they could be picked up for virtually nothing, was David Bowie. David Bowie was absolutely obsessed with her. And she was associated with surrealists and hung about with them, but she never really attained she certainly never attained their notoriety or their prominence in her life. She moved to the island of Jersey sometime during the 1930s with her lover, who was the illustrator Suzanne Malherbe, who also adopted a male alias, Marcel Moore. She describes Cahoon and Marcel Moore described themselves as neuter, putting themselves outside the usual categories of gender. Claude is one of the few names in France that could be used for both male and female. Now, I'd just like to point out, I think that before I move on, to talk about how brave she was. When they moved to Jersey to get away from France, and they lived quite a happy life, a quite isolated life, but the Nazis obviously invaded the Channel Islands during the 40s, and she was imprisoned. But she was also she was involved in a resistance and really put her and in particular, and Marcel Moore, put their lives on the line. And she was imprisoned and was threatened with execution several times. She sort of attempted sabotage, she passed information and things. And she was probably only saved from execution by the fact that the Allies liberated the island in 1945. When she was released from prison, she was photographed, and unfortunately I can't find a photograph anywhere. She was very weak, she had nothing to eat. She was holding a Nazi, the eagle, the eagle of the Nazis. She walked out of prison with that between her teeth, which I think shows incredible bravery. One of the most famous, now I'm going into kind of celebrity portraiture and showbiz and things, fashion, and of which probably one of the most important figures is obviously Man Ray. There's a few of his self-portraits here. That's obviously a solarized self-portrait. That's him as a sculptor, as a sculpture. I was being playful there. There's a self-portrait with Lee Miller. And his photographs, the photographs he took of Marcel Duchamp as the character Rose Selfie, where Marcel Duchamp was in drag, I think also quite extraordinary, particularly that one. And it's Duchamp again mucking about with shaving foam and things. These are some more the range of portraiture that Man Ray is capable of. That's the collector Edward James. You're obviously using a mirror in front of us. Alexander Rodchenko, the great Russian constructivist artist and photographer, I think was also another great pioneer of new techniques in portraiture. This portrait of his mother is obviously extremely famous, but he was also very good at, even though working in the Soviet Union at the time, things like fashion photography like that. It was a commercial job for a jewellery company, and that's a photograph of a woman photographer. That's Bill Brandt's Francis Bacon. So the next lot are sort of showing how expressionism and experimental techniques were used by photographers during the mid-20th century. That's Dora Maar's portrait of Nuche Eluard, the wife of the artist and wife of poet Paul Eluard. That's Heinz Hajek Helker, I can never remember his name, using sort of double exposure. That's a Herbert Matter portrait. John Deakin's photograph of Lucian Freud, which I think sort of actually captured the distressed nature of it, the torn nature of it, actually completely captures the personality of Freud. And you don't really need to see any of his artwork after seeing this. I much prefer this to anything by Freud. That's by Kansuke Yamamoto, and that's a portrait of his wife, and sort of using, that could be from a German horror film of the 20s. I had to put in a couple of images of Edith Sitwell. That's by Horst, because I think she's one of the most extraordinary characters of the 20th century. This, I think, is another extraordinary portrait. It's by Lois Dupré, and it's a portrait of Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. And you can see that what she's doing here, using the fragmentation of. It's actually, first time I ever saw this, I realised that it was Oppenheimer without being told. It's the eyes and the hat as well, I think, because I've seen other images, but I think that. Lartigue. And then, obviously, Hollywood portraiture. The public, general public, became quite visually literate, and Hollywood obviously had an insatiable appetite for images, and also with the growth of mass media. There was also a need for images, and obviously the way that the great stars were portrayed also had a lot in common with Renaissance portraiture and portraiture of royalty and mythical figures. So that's Anna May Wong by Carl van Vechten. You'll recognise a lot of these. That's not a Hollywood star, but that's an extraordinary photograph of the dancer master and choreographer Martha Graham by Steichen. Garbo. That's by Adolphe de Meyer, Jean Eagles. Joan Crawford. Rita Hayworth, Garbo again. Tyrone Power looking at himself as Narcissus. Tallulah Bankhead. There's a wonderful image there of Veronica Lake. Norma Shearer. Brando, obviously that's quite a famous photograph. Two images of Vivian Lee staring into mirrors, one in Gone with the Wind and Streetcar Named Desire. And often the images would actually consume the people portrayed in them, and would actually, as in obviously the case of Marilyn Monroe, was consumed by a public image. Fashion photography with the same aims. The next lot were by Beaton. There's another triptych of Edith Sitwell. That's a cosmetics advertisement from the 30s by Baron Adolphe de Meyer. And then the great era of that's by Horst, but this is also by Horst. So the playfulness and experimentation was not actually discouraged. It was encouraged by it, because the circulations of these magazines like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar was huge, and the budgets were enormous too. So there was great scope for experimentation and going out on a limb. This photograph, I'll hold on for a brief minute, because this is by William Klein, and it was commissioned by the Sunday Times magazine in 1962. I think shortly after the Sunday Times magazine just started. When it was originally published, it was cropped, and the man was cropped out. Often someone like the great photographer in Blumenfeld I love these images where he uses mannequins. And one of my favourite images, which is actually a collage by Herbert Matter, which was a cover of Harper's Bazaar in the early 40s. There's Erwin Blumenfeld again. No, I'm going to race through quite a lot of these, because otherwise I don't want to take you too long. So I'm going to go through some of the key figures of in portraiture of the post-war era. Obviously, Frida Kahlo is probably the most influential and most famous woman artist of all time, and increasingly popular, partly because she was dealing. She was dealing with dealing with women's with what it meant to be a woman, and in a way that hadn't really been portrayed, in an honest way that hadn't really been portrayed in art before. She was pretty obscure up until the 70s, and then really she was famous in Mexico, but really outside of Mexico she wasn't. She was hardly barely known at all. Obviously, as everyone I think knows, is aware, she suffered the most appalling health problems and a succession of physical crises throughout her life. And she spent long periods in traction and unable to, and in bed. And her life was pretty. She depicted. She used her physical. She was also hugely influential in the way she used her physical appearance to denote her as a symbolic, just her face, and in particular her clothing, actually conveyed messages in a way that would have initially have only made sense to fellow Mexicans, but now I think it can be read by everybody. And she was her whole persona, not just her art, but her whole persona, and the way she projected herself into the world was all an integral part of making herself her own subject of art. Francis Bacon, which I think is important. I think photographers actually learned from and stole some things from him. And then we go into American street photography, and there's a whole load of these. William Klein in the mid-50s, just taking snapshots of people on the street. And a very underrated Lisette model, who was an Austrian. She's a very interesting character, and I think she'll be more widely known. She was Austrian, and she moved to America during the 30s to escape the Nazis. She was originally a composer. She was a student of Arnold Schoenberg, but she bought a camera and started taking photographs of people on the streets of New York, and she took some remarkable self-portraits as well, like this one, which was taken in the very early 1940s and looks exactly like the work of some of her successors and one of her most famous pupil, who we'll get to next. That's also by her, which I think is extraordinary. That looks like a sort of Saul Light or Vivian Maier, and that's taken in the 40s too. Her most famous assistant was Diane Arbus, who worked for Lisette Model briefly, but they didn't really get on. Lisette Model's description of Diane Arbus when she first turned up in her studio was, she looks like somebody on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and I don't want to work with her. Diane Arbus is obviously hugely influential, and this was something that, when her work was first displayed after in a major exhibition, in the very early 1970s, people were appalled, and they now sell for millions. People were absolutely appalled when it was in MoMA, New York MoMA, the first exhibition. Every night, at the end of the day, the cleaners had to clean off the saliva from the frames in competition because people were spitting at them, because they hadn't seen this before. They were disgusted at these, and she was dismissed as being somebody just photographing freaks, or being cruel to your lack of humanity. But what she was really doing, I think, is creating a human dimension to unconventional and extravagant individuals, people living on the fringe. And this is a strand of photography and portraiture that obviously hugely important to this day, and influenced every sort of Nan Goldins of this world right now. her life, she was basically, it was a fairly new aesthetic, fairly honest and candid. So, the antithesis of her is Saul Leiter, who is now increasingly after being fairly obscure up until maybe 10 years ago, is now incredibly popular and revered as one of the great photographers of the 20th century. Now, his view, what he was attempting to do, he was quite painterly in his use of work. It's the opposite of Arbus. He's not stripping back. He's not finding the despair and the skull beneath the skin of people. He's of the inner turmoil. He's making the city look a beautiful place, but using unusual techniques to do so. He is using abstract forms and innovative compositions, and he was interested in conveying the humanity of any subjects he came across. He also was a rather brilliant fashion photographer. Did lots of work both here and in the States as a self-portrait. Inevitably come to Vivian Maier, who up until 7 or 8 years ago was almost completely unknown. She obviously worked as a nanny for most of her life in Chicago and New York, and taking photographs in her spare time. It is estimated she took over 150,000 photographs, primarily the people and architecture of the cities she lived in. She was unheralded and unknown in her time. It was only when a collector bid for a box of photographs in a blind auction and discovered these extraordinary wealth of material in them that they realised that there was an unrecognised and disregarded genius. They are quite extraordinary, and they continue to her reputation grows sort of not by the day, then certainly by the year. She was playful as well. If you look at the range of these self-portraits, the way the inventiveness and the technique she uses and the strategy she uses to get different, refreshing images. That's extraordinary, using the horseshoe crab. Usually she has a camera in hand, but not always. And she knows exactly what she's doing. I mean, that's brilliant. She knows there's a theatricality to her work, definitely. She's not just a mere hobbyist who happens to like taking loads of snaps. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she knew her art history too. There's sort of references to the great Renaissance self-portraiters and to the great photographers who are her predecessors. And I just think that she is one of the great photographers. I love that with but not only a great photographer of self-portraits, but also portraits of other people. There's these small selection shows, both black and white and colour. I can't really discuss portraiture without Andy Warhol, who again was very, very aware of art history and deliberately, for example, in his late series, the Frightwig series, which was taken in 1980, which he painted in 1986. He always remained at heart a good Catholic boy, and these, underneath it all, a lot of his portraits, particularly this series, they definitely reference Catholic and Byzantine iconography, the way that his head is framed in the darkness. It is like a traditional religious icon. And obviously they're all playing with gender and role-playing and identity of all the Polaroid photographs, particularly all the ones in drag. And there's a member of Motley Crue. And be remiss not to mention Basquiat, because Basquiat obviously was probably is possibly now that his work he's achieved records at auction and his reputation increases by the year, and he is, a lot of his work is self-portrait based, and it's looking, obviously he was looking at contradictory impulses. He was in dual identity. He was and he uses himself in so many of his works. He was a sort of wild child, but he was also incredibly refined, and his knowledge of art history was incredible. Like that, the arrow is actually represents paintbrush, and it has references to paintings of saints, so it's deliberately references Saint Sebastian, and he was somebody that was a huge celebrity, but he was also very shy. There were all kinds of contradictions in his work. He was obviously a black street artist, a child of Puerto Rican and Haitian parents, but he sort of has forced, where he achieved the most success was in the white, extremely wealthy world of art collectors and Upper West Side and Warhol and people. But I think his reputation will continue to grow. There's a kind of exuberance and playfulness and joy at work in his art that very, very few people in the last 50 years had. Let me come on to Cindy Sherman, who I think you'll know, who the key figure of Pictures Generation, which is a loose circle of American artists coming to prominence in the late 70s, early 80s. She was first started off as a painter, and then not getting too much success in that. She started taking photographs of herself as various female stereotypes and images from popular culture and the mass media, from Hollywood, TV, fashion things. And as her original series of untitled film stills were like black and white, and they could be sort of hit characters from a Hitchcock film or a film noir of the 40s, and there may be women in peril, and maybe women about to commit some regrettable act, or they may be women who are suffering a crisis of some sort or another. And as her art evolved and her fame evolved, she then grew into parody, as in this parody of Caravaggio, and started dressing up and becoming more, using more and more props, and even drawing on traditional showbiz, stand-up comedy things. But within Cindy Sherman, they're not self-portraits. She isn't there. And this is an important thing with many of the artists who were influenced by her, and people have gone to creating self-portraits in the last 30, 40 years. She isn't there. You could look for her all you like, but she isn't there. If she walked into this room, you probably wouldn't recognise her. Okay, yeah. Right, I'm going to rush on now, because I want to get to Kim Kardashian as quickly as possible. Robert Mapplethorpe, obviously using gender and identity. Nan Goldin, obviously it's one of the most influential photographers in the world today, documenting her real life struggles of a group of friends in New York in the 80s and beyond, and fearless realism. She actually lived a life. She wasn't a fake. She did everything. And I wanted to include William Eggleston, who is obviously better known. Is not as well known for his portraits as other things, but I think his portraits are absolutely extraordinary. And they are really groundbreaking. They if you look at the new generation of, these were taken in like the 50s and 60s and early and up to the 70s. People like Ryan McGinley or Corinne Day, and even people like David Lynch are hugely influenced by his work. There's a self-portrait of him in typical gun mode. And one of the last of the great self-dramatising artists is Francesca Woodman, who obviously she committed suicide at a very young age, and she took her first self-portrait when she was 13, and then until she killed herself at age 22, she produced an incredible body of work using her body as often appearing naked, often disappearing into the background. It really is an interrogation of identity. And I particularly wanted to include Jean-Paul Goude, because I think that although he is incredibly controversial and provocative figure, he has been one of the most influential artists in recent decades, and his influence is all pervasive, certainly in popular culture and in popular music and advertising and fashion photography. Obviously, he's best known for his collaborations with Grace Jones, although he's worked latterly with Björk and, as we will see, Kim Kardashian, drawing on, he's using primitive, this is before Photoshop, so he was using cut and paste techniques and double exposures and things, and cutting and pasting to make Grace Jones look angular and to change her appearance and things like that, and using techniques, referencing things like the Bauhaus and expressionism and constructivism. And I think he is undervalued because of the controversial nature of his work, in that he was addressing, certainly in terms of he's been accused of racism because of his exploiting racist stereotypes of an exotic and predatory black woman, and some of the images with like Grace Jones in cage and things were obviously very, very problematic. But in terms of visual style, he's people like Lady Gaga and sort of uncountable pop stars and media sensations use stuff by him. And he was also used by Kim Kardashian for the photo session which broke the internet. There's this one and the other ones which I won't show you. Now I'm almost coming to the end, but I wanted to go, before we get to selfies, I want to have a brief diversion. I can do this quite quickly. I wanted to just talk briefly about internet dating. And the way that people present themselves. We're talking about self as brand. Internet dating is very important. Nowadays, with people's lifestyles, one of the ways that most people find a lot of people don't work in conventional offices, they don't socialise in the way they used to, and so people increasingly, if they want to find a partner, or if they want to, they just want to have a casual liaison, then they will use internet dating sites. And there are numbers of them that grow up. Dozens of them appear. New dating sites appear every year. But I wanted to go through briefly just a quick survey of some of the visual cliches that are used, and when people attempt to sell themselves and promote themselves to potential partners via dating sites. Now, there are a certain number of set cliches. If you look at Tinder and all the other things, Grindr, Elite Singles, all that, OkCupid and things, you'll find that people on dating sites, they're always humanitarian. They will often, a common theme is that people will photograph themselves in third world situations, showing themselves with photogenic African or Central American children, trying to look as empathetic as possible while standing next to thoroughly bemused children. Some of them may be incredibly offensive, such as this fellow with some very ill-advised shorts next to a obviously very disgusted looking Maasai warrior, and these very empathetic women with a woman, an Asian woman. Now, there is a kind of, they're obviously trying to emphasise their selflessness and compassion, but basically using that as a mask to basically get laid or find a partner. People on Tinder, they've all been to Machu Picchu too, as you'll see here. These are all just from Tinder. I haven't looked through Tinder myself, I'd have to say. These are all from the internet. So Tinder must be like, Machu Picchu must be like some sort of branch of All Bar One or something. Some of them even been to Machu Picchu on Christmas Day, a woman there, and some. These are all genuine photographs. People on dating sites, they also love food and fine dining, and the finer things in life. That is a genuine photograph. I dread to think what's in that glass, but anyway. They also love working out and taking photographs of their buff and hench bodies in the mirror. Such as these fellows. And they also like taking photographs. This is on Tinder. I'm not sure what I'm doing on Tinder. They also like taking photographs. Often seem to be in state of undress with their bros. Or selfies in bathrooms. They also love going to festivals. There will often be group shots of them gurning at some sort of corporate sponsored festival, taking selfies there to prove. Burning Man's quite popular with people. They also love cats and dogs. Even cats and dogs that are maybe heavily sedated. There are hundreds of images of people with tigers. As it's disgusting. I don't know why people think they're being photographed with tigers. And there actually are actual cats on dating sites too. Seriously, again, apparently there are hundreds of people just as cats. They love cars. And they may not know how to use Photoshop, though, or anything. This guy's got an almost complete set of some of the major tropes on dating sites. So he obviously does extreme sports. He's very sporty. He does surfing. He's got an expensive car there, and he's surrounded by mates. So he's very popular too. So they also like performing yoga. So whether it be on the mountaintops of extreme yoga, or whether it be on a beach at sunset. Now, the beaches at sunset are usually women. So. They're also a vogue for women impersonating Lemmy from Motorhead, which obviously men find irresistible. There are gun nuts, which include, unfortunately, that Russell Brand seems to have let himself go slightly. Another thing, which is a kind of virtue signature, people with shelfies, I believe is the term, where people photograph an artfully arranged collection of books. Like this guy has Natalie might be able to help. He's got I think he's got quite a valuable collection of, probably not first editions there of Harry Potter. There were the Potters there and things, Harry Potter and stuff. This woman is obviously very keen to advertise the fact that she's both spiritual and a keen reader, but unfortunately she hasn't quite. There's something wrong there. I put this guy in here because one of the most popular author that seems to pop up on shelf is David Foster Wallace. So there you see the copy of Infinite Jest there, but obviously people sort of behind him. He seems to be very popular. And then there are people that are just plain odd. Like this guy who says the first thing people notice about me is how much I resemble Jerry Seinfeld, who was most famous for playing Superman, obviously. Or this person dressed as an Easter bunny. Or this guy who says, what's the most private thing I'm willing to admit? I've never had sex with a boy or man, and you should message me if you're not a boy or a man. So, then now come on to selfies. Now, selfies, they conflict. have changed social interaction, the way we interact with people. That's James Franco being one of them. So we're in a kind of Mobius strip of self-reference. So you get instances like John Hamm taking a photograph of himself with wax model of him. Well, this guy in front of David, I suspect that may have been doctored, or it may be a screen, or a photograph with the Pope. A very unconvincing wax model of the Queen, and a very unconvincing wax model of the King. The first ever selfie in space, a Japanese astronaut. Some of you may remember this bloke, and some of you probably more fondly remember this man here. I just love the juxtaposition of the stripes with the tank. That's a Martin Parr photograph. This I suspect is a joke, but apparently it isn't. It's a sort of extreme selfishness. And I think the juxtaposition of that and the photograph and the wonderful sculpture there is spectacular. And I just love this. Again, that's Martin Parr in Pisa, where everybody seems to have the same idea. They're all being photographed with the same pose. So every hour of every day in Pisa Square, you'll see 30 people pretending to push back the leaning tower. Then there's a lack of self-awareness. Now, I haven't put the worst examples of these, but it's kind of a lack of sensitivity. These things are horrible, but I think it's something apart. These obviously disgusting and caused outrage. But it's easy to have sort of moral outrage about things like that. But I don't think selfies are the end of Western civilization, and I think there's a temporary phase of self-absorption. Then things will happen, and there are artists using it like this guy. I will go over him, and he's reached notoriety. Romain Matter, a Swiss artist who basically did a project where he created a fictional village in Ukraine, and he claimed that he was going there to find a wife. And he's a parody of Western European men going to Eastern Europe to find wives. He's at this fictional town called Ekaterina, where all the women were called Ekaterina, and they all had conformed to a certain stereotype. They all looked like this. They all had a certain breast size. They all had a certain hair colour. They all had certain eye colours and things. But he's won a lot of awards and a lot of attention for this. They came kind of poses as the really popular people on Instagram, and took on the roles of cute girl, sugar baby, and life goddess, a la Gwyneth Paltrow, and using hashtags. She used to break into hotels and fancy hotels and restaurants in Los Angeles and London, and photograph herself in these rooms. And it's a performance. She's playing at being an Instagram sensation. You've got great artists like Ai Weiwei using selfies in an interesting way, and then that's a kind of meta thing there with him and Paris Hilton in front of one of his sculptures. And then to the biggest star of the selfie era, Kim Kardashian. And I will leave most of these images to speak for themselves, that of her and Kanye West taking a photograph of their first child. She's taking a photograph as well. She's taking a selfie, he's taking a portrait of her, and she's wearing fur. And these two, this is actually, now this is where we really go through the rabbit hole, because this is an installation of Madame Tussauds. So this is a wax figure of Kim Kardashian taking a photograph of herself in front of back projections. And so you get lots of people will take a photograph of themselves, a selfie of themselves, with a wax model of Kim Kardashian taking a photograph of herself, and that's probably the way the world ends. And this is not quite the last image, it's almost the last image. And I think that this is possibly the most important work of art of the last 20th century. So we reach a position where Kanye West in front of the Mona Lisa. Now, contrary to a lot of doomsayers and doommongers and things, I don't think that. I think that the novelty value of the era of self-absorption will wear off, and the law of diminishing returns. People will get sick to death of doing it. I was on a plane a couple of months ago. It was an EasyJet flight, a 3-hour EasyJet flight, and people in front of me was a row of 4 young women, young teenage women, and in front of them were people who are obviously their mother or people a generation older than them. And I counted from the time they got on the plane, the girl sitting in the middle of the row, central seat, from the minute they'd sat down and settled into their seat to the minute the plane landed and they got out of their seat, she was just taking photographs of herself the whole time. It was like 3 hours. And she was, what's more, and she was getting up and she was endlessly fascinated by this. And she was showing them to her friends or sisters and to her mother or aunt or whoever the older people were. And it's just endless fascination. And this cannot last. It's a novelty thing, and I think the novelty will wear off. It could be easy to see, for some sort of Jeremiah, to see that this picture, for example, the Kardashians and the cultural prominence of people like her, and this picture here as a irrefutable evidence of an imminent apocalypse and the calamity of Western decline and the end of days. But I think that in a few years, selfies are. We will have. Can you imagine in the world of the future, curators and academics of the future? Academics and curators not paying much attention to this stuff now, but it's the most extraordinary record documentation of everyday life. Imagine what we could see if you had millions of selfies from Imperial Rome. Selfies represent the shift of photographs from a memorial function, memorializing and fixing something in time, to a form of communication. That is what photography is becoming with smartphones, and it is a way, instead of having something set and fixed, is a way of communicating. They're disposable, but there are also things that will have lasting value, I think. And I think that with advance of technology and tweaking and the new platforms, there will be geniuses of this new art form. You can portray everything. Portray love, suffering, sex, pain, adventure, family, history, sickness, death. There'll be holographic selfies in a few years' time, which will be extraordinary. One day, I think there will also be new forms of storytelling and narrative. They won't replace the novel, and they probably won't completely replace cinema and TV, but they will be something new. There could also, in terms of storytelling, one day there could even be Selfie Dickens or Dostoevsky or Kafka or Proust, with Proust actually probably more likely, or even Harry Potter. There will be great selfies, but one thing I think needs to be done before we actually get great selfies. We need to get rid of the stupid word. It's a very juvenile and twee word, selfie, which is very grating. How could you possibly have a Dürer or Velázquez or Dante or Rembrandt of a selfie using the word selfie? And that's it. Really.